Well, let's fill some time talking about a 16-year-old who gets totally lost on his first solo cross-country flight. He came that close to being his last flight. That close to being his last thing ever in this life. It was June 14th, 1967. And I pulled into the parking lot of the Coweta Airport, and first thing I did when I got out of the car was look up at the sky, because that's what I'd been doing. I walked out the door that morning of my house, I looked up at the sky, and when I driving to the airport, I was looking up at the sky. When I got out of the car, I looked up at the sky because the sky was totally overcast as far as you could see, and I couldn't tell how high that ceiling was. And I was thinking maybe I shouldn't go today. And just then I heard from the side of me, Billy Skinner, my instructor, he had snuck up on me, and Billy said, "You ready to go?" And I looked over at him and said, "You think I ought to go today?" He said, "You going to be a fair weather pilot?" And inside I thought, well, yeah, maybe. But I said, no, I guess not. But before I get to the actual flight itself, I want to go back in time a bit. I was sitting at home one day, and my Eastern Airline pilot father came in, and he said he had just been out to the Coweta Airport. And he had signed a contract for me to get a private pilot's license. I remember it cost $624. That was for 40 hours of flying time. You had to have 40 hours to get a private pilot's license. 20 of those hours was dual instruction and 20 solo. Ended up taking me a little more than that, and I'll tell you about why in just a minute, because I soon started my lessons, and things soon got really interesting. I had my first lesson April 19th, 1967. That was about 6 months past my 16th birthday. My instructor was Howard G. Duncan. I remember the Howard G. part only because that's what he wrote in my logbook. I called him Mr. Duncan. He was a tall man, dark hair, wore dark glasses, and he always had a button-down shirt with a tie on. So I called him Mr. Duncan. And my first lesson was in this plane, a Cessna 150, 3626 Juliet. Now look, if you're flying in a 150, you better be friends with whoever you're flying with, because your knees are going to be rubbing. It is a tiny cockpit. So there are two things that I have a clear memory of for that first lesson. The first thing was when we were down at the end of the runway ready to take off, and he said, "Okay, take off." And I was like, "What? Me?" Obviously we had talked it through, but I did it. And it wasn't hard. And then we went up, and according to the logbook, we did some turns, and then we did some stalls. At one point, after we had done all that stuff, Mr. Duncan said, "Well, this is going to be easy. You're a natural pilot." And boy, was I proud of that. Natural pilot. Well, then I had lessons 2, 3, 4. I don't remember any of those, but I remember the fifth lesson big time. In the pre-flight time, he told me we were going to do all this stuff, but this is what I remember. He added in there that we're going to do spin recovery. Now, spin recovery is not, or hasn't been, part of the private pilot training protocol since, the 40s, late 40s, I think. They had some data that more people were killed practicing spin recoveries than people who actually got into spins and died when they were flying. So what they emphasized was never getting in a spin, and they would work on stall recovery and that sort of thing so that you wouldn't get in the spins. But Mr. Duncan, I guess, thought we need spin recovery. So I was a little nervous about that. I guess my stomach was a little queasy thinking about doing that. The only thing I'd seen about spins was World War II movies where a plane would get shot down and that didn't look good to me. So I was kind of nervous anyway. And then we got in this 150, and like I told you, it's a tiny cockpit, and somebody had cleaned it since the day before because it reeked of this cleaning fluid, and that made me stomach even more queasy. But it turned out spins were great. Man, I loved it. It was like having your own amusement park. I really had fun. So I couldn't wait till the next lesson the next day to see what new stuff we were going to do. And I went out to the airport, and Mr. Duncan wasn't there. In fact, he was missing. He had headed off to some town in Alabama that morning by himself, and he was supposed to have been back a long time before my lesson, and he wasn't back, and they didn't know where he was. And that was very worrisome. But then they found him eventually. He had landed at another airport, not the one he was supposed to go to, and he had kind of stumbled into the fixed base operator office and passed out on the sofa, drunk. And that's when, it was a little later in life that I realized that cleaning fluid I smelled, that wasn't cleaning fluid. I didn't know what alcohol smelled like. My dad would drink a beer occasionally after yard work, and I had a friend whose parents had cocktails every day at 5 o'clock. They were cool 50s, Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin, sunken living room and all that. But I didn't really smell the alcohol, so it turns out I think that my instructor who did spin recovery was a little bit hammered. So he wasn't my instructor anymore, and I had to get another one, and pretty soon I was learning about stuff like dusting crops. So my instructor was long gone, and I didn't have one. So they filled in with a couple of airline pilots that had instructor licenses. One was a guy named Mr. Teasley, and the other was my dad, my hero, who was an instructor for the Army Air Corps during World War II. And then he flew for Eastern Airlines, and at the time that I was learning to fly, he was an instructor on the Boeing 727 for Eastern Airlines. I'm going to do a video on my dad's flying career, and so I'll save all that for later. But pretty quickly, they did hire a new instructor, and his name was Billy Skinner. Now, I didn't call Billy Mr. Skinner because he told me not to, and Billy just wasn't a Mr. kind of guy. He's a wonderful guy. I love him, but he was laid back, and he didn't dress in button-down shirts and ties. Now, he was a 38-year-old crop duster in the off-season. You can't dust crops all year long, and he had to make money, so he took this instructor job. Now, here's Billy talking to me before my first solo. And then here I am after my first solo with him holding my shirt tail. The tradition is that you cut your shirt tail off after your first solo. Now, I still got that hanging on the wall down the hall, as you can see. Now, one of the things I like about the internet is tracking down people from my past. And so one year I decided to try to track down Billy. Unfortunately, what I found was his obituary. He died and he was 87. I wish I had done that sooner, but you know how that goes. Now, I want to tell you about 3 things that Billy didn't like. But before I do that, I want to talk about what he did do for me. Billy was a terrific pilot. You've got to be, if you're going to be a crop duster. Man, you're spending your life a few feet off the ground, and then you're making these steep turns right close to the ground so you can turn around and come back and hit the crops again. And Billy, for sure, he taught me how to fly, man. I mean, he was a terrific pilot. He was a very good instructor when it came to teaching you all the flying techniques and the things to watch out for. So I was always grateful for that, and it sure came in handy later for sure. On the other hand, there were 3 things Billy just didn't like. One of them was altitude. He was no fan of altitude. We barely ever got above 500 feet. If we were doing stalls or something, we'd go to 1,000. Now, he told me, you better, when you practice, be up at 1,500, 2,000 feet when you're practicing stalls. But, I don't know, he felt confident down there, and he thought climbing was wasting time. So altitude, he's not a fan of that. The other is avionics, aviation electronics, things like radios, communications that you call for the control tower and stuff, and then instruments that you have that help you navigate. And I'm going to get all into that in a little bit. And then the other thing is he didn't worry much about the weather that you couldn't see. Now, yeah, as you know, you're going to be a fair weather pilot, you already picked up on that. And after I flew some practice solo stuff for a while, he said it was time to do a dual cross country. Now, in flying, cross country doesn't mean New York to L.A. It means you're flying from your airport to another airport, and you're proving you can navigate along the way. So the dual cross country is one where he went with me, and he's supposed to teach me what I'm supposed to do. Now, I don't remember a lot about that, but there are things. I do remember one thing I'll talk about in a minute. But he did show me how to take a sectional chart. Now, here's a sample of a sectional chart. It's a chart that you use to navigate with, and it has all kinds of things showing on the map, like rivers, lake, railroad tracks, and roads, and cities, and towers, and stuff that you can look at and match on the map and know where you are. Theoretically, that is. And you draw a line on that, and then you fold that map up and you put it in your lap, and that way you can see the map and where you're going, and that's what you do. And he taught me how to do that. And the thing I remember about the trip was that he showed me how to work a navigation aid called a VOR, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. He wasn't a fan of radios that you use to talk to people on the ground. We'll talk about that in a minute. So after the dual cross country, I did some more solo work, and then he said it was time to do a solo cross country where I went by myself. But what about the weather? So it's June 14, 1967, and I'm ready now for my first solo cross country. Now, the first thing I did was pre-flight the plane, and I was flying a different 150 than the one I soloed in, the pictures that I showed you before. And I showed you a pretty recent picture of 3626 Juliet. I don't have a recent picture of the plane I did the first cross-country solo in. That was 8780 Sierra. And the reason I don't have a picture of it because it doesn't exist anymore. These planes, they'll last forever because they take such good care of them unless you wreck them. And that's what happened to 80 Sierra. But it was there on that morning in 1967, and the first thing I did was do a pre-flight. And that's when you check the airplane, you check the oil, and then you walk around and you lower the flap so you can check the hinges in the flap, and then you make sure that the ailerons and the elevators and the rudders can move, and you look at their hinges to make sure they look all right, and you check the tires, and you do all that. And then I climbed in the plane, and I had the map folded just like it's supposed to with the line drawn, and I knew the heading I was supposed to head off on. So pretty soon, let me say this, during the pre-flight, as I looked at everything on the plane, I kept looking up at those clouds, just like I was doing when I left home and I was driving and I got there. I was just kept looking, are they getting lower? What's going on with them? And after I taxied out to the end of the runway and I lined up the runway, I looked up at the clouds again. This is my chance to go back and say, yeah, I am a fair weather pilot. But I just couldn't do that. So I took off and I left the pattern. I'll talk about patterns in a little bit because that plays a part in this story. And I climbed up to my altitude. And then as soon as I got settled down with that, I got in the right altitude, everything, and I was on the right heading, I looked up at the clouds again. Still trying to figure out if they were getting lower or getting higher or what. And I kept looking at them. And I finally decided, oh, well, heck with it, just go on. But there was a big problem with just going on. So I took one more look up at the clouds, and then I settled down and said, okay, time to go to Rome. And I look around. I look down, and this is what I see in all directions. I say, okay, where am I? And I look at my map, and all I see are forests and fields. I didn't see any roads. So every now and then I'd see something like a little creek, and I'd see if I could find that on the map. There were two, the map had a lot of water features, but not little bitty ditch creeks. I kept looking and looking, and I kept flying, and I kept going, where am I? And I began to have a little creepy feeling in my stomach. I said, I need to find out where I am, because all I was seeing were those farms and fields. And then I remembered something. I remembered that dual cross country that I did with Billy on the way to Tuscaloosa. And on the way, he had showed me how to use a VOR. And that's something that would take me to Rome, because Rome had a VOR. And Billy had shown me on the map that day when he said, here's where the frequency is for the VOR. So I tuned in the frequency just like he did. And then I did what he said to do. See that OBS right there? That's a knob. And you turn that knob until that little window says 2 there on the right side on this VOR. They're different places on different brand VORs, but that's where it is on that one. So you center the needle. And once you get the needle centered, what he said was you keep that needle centered, and it'll take you to the VOR. And I knew the VOR, it wasn't on the airport, but it was about a few miles from the airport. And I figured once I found the VOR, I'd know where I was. Wouldn't be just forests and fields. So I centered that VOR just like you're supposed to. And then all of a sudden, it went off to the right. And I know this is a different looking VOR, but like I said, different brands are different. The needle's off to the right. Well, I think what he said was, keep it centered. And that's all he told me. So I reached to that OBS knob you see there, and I center the needle again. It keeps going off to the right, and I just reach up and center that needle. And look, I know all y'all pilots are going, oh, my, OMG. How stupid are you? Well, look, I was 16 years old. My reasoning powers were just a little bit not quite developed yet. Somehow I thought all he told me was center the needle. So I kept centering the needle. Well, here's what happened. I keep centering the needle because that sucker keeps moving over there to the right. And so finally, one last time I center it, and then that little window there where the yellow arrow is up at the top, that yellow arrow, switches to from. It was saying to, but now all of a sudden it's saying from, and I look down, and I've never been to Rome. Here's the deal. We had only lived in Newnan and Georgia for 1 year. We'd lived in New Orleans, and then Eastern Airlines closed the base in 1964, and we went to Miami for a year, and that, I'm going to have video on that, the worst year of my life. And then we moved up to Newnan a year before this was happening, so I didn't know anything about Rome or North Georgia, anything above Newnan. But I could tell from the map that Rome was a pretty big city. It was bigger than Newnan, and I'd see Newnan from there. I wasn't going to miss it. And it went from to to from. Where to go? I mean, I don't see anything but forest and fields. So I decided that sucker's broken. It just broke, Woe is me. The VOR is broke. Now, look, I'm going to take an aside. Anybody who's a pilot knows what I was doing, but if you're not a pilot, might not know. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how a VOR works. It's not going to be a big deal, but a little bit. This is a VOR, I don't know what you call them, station. This is the radio transmitter, and you have them all over the country, and they emit radio signals, and they have one signal for every degree of the compass. And these signals, radio signals, transmission that they send out, each one of those for every degree is called a radial. And radials are like highways. And what I found out later that night, because when my father heard this story, he was just like, oh, holy smokes. So he sat down in the living room with me and showed me how VORs work. But yeah, you're supposed to keep the needle centered, but once you center the needle, that means you've centered it. It's right on the radio. Look at that third plane down. The needle's centered, and it's right on the radio. Now, plane in the next one down goes off to the left. The needle moves off to the right. That's telling you need to center the needle, not by turning the knob again, but by turning the plane. And you turn the plane until it centers again. That means at the bottom one, you're back on the highway. And so you keep flying along, and as the needle starts going to the right, you turn to the right till it's centered again, and that keeps you on the radio. Now, this shows what I did, and I couldn't find anything, so I made my own. I want you to notice at the bottom, anybody steals this, I'm going to give you a copyright strike. I'm just kidding. You can use it if you want. You see those radials, and you see my airplane down at the bottom, and a little window is saying 2 in the VOR, and I'm flying north. Okay, so I center the needle at that first X from the bottom, and I'm on that radio. But then I start still flying north, and that radio's going off to my right, and so the needle's going to the right. So then I said, I'm going to center that needle again, and that's the next X up. And then up, radio starts going again. And then finally, I get to directly west of the VOR station, and now I'm flying away from the VOR station, so it flips to from. And that's what happens when you center the needle by using the knob instead of flying to center the needle. Like I said, my father was really appalled when he heard this. Whoa. And how dumb can you get? What do you think? Is some magic instrument? So I give up on the VOR, but I'm still flying along over forests and fields, and I'm thinking eventually I'm going to get to Rome. Although Rome should have taken, about a half an hour to get there, and I'm already at 40 minutes, but I don't know. I figure I'll get there eventually. And the overcast didn't look like it was coming down. It looked like it was staying there, so I thought, well, the weather looks okay. But there was a big problem that started developing. Even though the overcast wasn't coming down, there was something coming up, and that was the ground. The ground started coming up, and pretty soon I was just right above the ground, and then I was flying through a valley with mountaintops on either side of me. What am I doing in the mountains? Again, I don't know anything about North Georgia, and I thought, I didn't know Rome was in the mountains. So now I'm getting a little bit nervous, because if my engine quit, there wasn't a whole lot of places where I could land. There weren't any fields, and I was still thinking Rome was going to show up at some point. And then finally, like an hour after I took off, way past when I should have been in Rome, I turned the corner in the valley, and there was something I recognized, and it looked like this. That was an interstate being built. And the reason I knew what that was because I-85 coming out of Atlanta to the southwest stopped right before it got to Newnan, the completed part did. And then they were working on it past that. So I had flown all around over the past few weeks over an interstate being built. So I knew what that was. And I knew that interstate had to go somewhere. So So I decided I was going to follow that interstate being built. And I'm following it along, and all of a sudden it came to a part that was finished. There was cars going back and forth. And when I got to that finished part, pretty soon I saw a big interstate sign down there. And I said, I'm going to find out where I am. I'm going to fly down there and see where I am. And, you know, Billy, being the crop duster he was, like I told you, he didn't like altitude, so I knew how to fly low. So I got down real low, not quite this low, but low enough to be able to read the sign. And it said, Lookout Mountain. Actually, the sign I saw said Lookout Mountain, next exit. That means I knew where Lookout Mountain was. I didn't know anything about North Georgia. But about 4 or 5 years before that, and we lived in New Orleans, and my family had gone up to the Smoky Mountains to camp. And we had stopped on the way at Lookout Mountain and seen 7 states. And I knew Lookout Mountain was outside of Chattanooga. What? So I'm flying along, following that interstate, and it's going down the valley in the mountains, and then the valley makes another turn, and all of a sudden, this is what I see. A big city, Chattanooga. Man, I had flown to Tennessee. Was I relieved? I mean, I was surprised, but I was also relieved. I knew where I was finally. And then I saw something in the distance. Something that I love seeing. The Chattanooga airport up that way. And I thought, I need to get on the ground. I need to get oriented. I need to come up with a plan to get back. And I still was planning on going to Rome. I had to get my logbook signed, prove I could do a cross country successfully. And so I decided I was going to land now that I know where I am. But there's another really big thing that I don't know. So now I can look across the distance and I can see the airport there. But there's a problem with this that I got to figure something out. Chattanooga is a pretty big city, and that's a pretty big looking airport, and I figured it's probably got a control tower. Now, we have controlled and uncontrolled airports, and if it's a controlled airport, it means it has a control tower, and you're supposed to call the control tower. In fact, you have to before you land. I mean, that's the rules. Let's talk about this radio business for just a moment. I told you Billy didn't like avionics much, and I already told you about navigation avionics, VOR, center of the needle. That was it, my entire instruction. Well, my entire instruction on the part of the avionics where you talk to people on radios consisted only about what's called Unicom with uncontrolled airports. Uncontrolled airports don't have a tower, but most of them do have a radio tuned to a frequency called Unicom. And when I was flying, at least in our area of the country, it was 122.8. So you know whatever uncontrolled airports you went to, you could try calling them on Unicom and getting some information about what's going on before you land. So I knew all about Unicom, and if it had been an uncontrolled airport, I knew how to call them and all that, but I didn't know what to do with the controlled airport. Didn't have any idea. Now, I could tell from the sectional chart that there were a couple of uncontrolled airports in the area, and there they were, but here's the deal. I could see the Chattanooga airport. I saw it right there in the distance. I was going to have to go hunting these other two, the one with the green background arrow and the one with the light blue background arrow. And I was way over here where it says I am here on the left side. So I was going to have to go over there and hunt them down. And I saw that Chattanooga airport. So that's the one I wanted to land in, even though I didn't know how to call them. But you know, I should have known where to look for it because I did know where to look for VOR frequency. I knew how to see that on the map. There it was. Billy had showed me that when he showed me about how a VOR worked. He showed me on the map where you could find the frequency. And it should have occurred to me that if there's a VOR frequency on the map, probably there's a control tower frequency, but it didn't even cross my mind. But there it is right on the map, but I didn't know. Again, I was 16 years old, and I was trying to figure things out as I was going along after I'd just been lost, so it just didn't cross my mind to look on the chart and see if there was a frequency I could use. You know, one that said CT for like control tower. Okay, so I'm sitting there thinking I'm not going to go look for airports, and I don't know how to call them. And then I see something in the distance. I see a Delta jet. I think it was a DC-9, and the landing gear were down, and it was flying right across the horizon in front of me, just like you see there. And I said, okay, those guys are landing. I'm just going to follow them. So that's what I do. I don't call anybody. I just get in behind that Delta jet. And then I see it turning, it does sure enough, it turned base, and then it saw it land, so I just went behind it and landed. Now, once I was on the airport, I had to figure out where to go. And Chattanooga Airport had one concourse going out where airliners were sitting around, but on the other side, there was a little building or a hangar with a building attached to it, and it had a bunch of airplanes sitting around it. This is an image of the Chattanooga Airport from about the time that I had this trip. And so I figured I need to taxi over where all the little airplanes are, so I did that. And as I approached that little building there, a guy came out and told me where to park. And then as I was climbing out of the airplane, he said, "Control tower wants to talk to you." I glanced up to my right there. You can see the control tower. And I thought, oh, great. I'm 16 years old, and I'm going to be banned for life from getting a license. I just landed at this controlled airport and didn't talk to anybody. So I went in, and the guy gave me the number of the control tower, and I called the control tower. And I told him who I was. I called myself Eddie then. I said, "I'm Eddie Wyrick, and I just landed, and I was supposed to call you." The guy said, "You didn't call us." I said, "Yeah, I didn't know how." And then I told him how I was a student pilot and stuff. I even added at the ending, I'm only 16. And he was a nice guy, you know. He said, okay. And he told me what I needed to do when I left. He gave me the frequency for ground control. They have a ground control frequency and then the frequency of the control tower, and you call ground control first. Now, in an airport the size of Chattanooga, you're really talking to the same people, but by using different frequencies, you keep things organized. So he told me to call them, and then once I called them, they would guide me through the rest of it. They would tell me where to go, tell me which frequency to change to when I was ready to take off. And then he said this. He said, when you take off, if you look over to your right, on down there a little bit, you're going to see a highway. And that's Highway 27. Oh, and I told him that I was trying to get to Rome and that I was going to land at Rome next. And so he said, you'll see Highway 27, and that's going to take you right to Rome. And the Rome airport's right next to Highway 27. So you can just follow that road. Well, I knew Highway 27 because Highway 27 went to Noonan too. So I could follow that highway all the way to Noonan. So after resting a little bit and taking a break and just trying to relax and get over being all the anxiety that I had, I climbed back in. I called the tower. They were very nice to me. And when I took off, I looked over to the right. Now, that's gotten all developed now in the last 50 years since this flight I took happened. So it was very clear there where Highway 27 was. So I shot straight ahead to Highway 27 and took a left turn, and I followed Highway 27. And I didn't keep my eyes off of Highway 27. And with a highway to follow now, I figured I was safe. But not necessarily, man. I just about didn't make it. I want to tell you, I kept my eye on Highway 27 the entire time to Rome. I never took my eyes off of it except every now and then look back at the instruments right in front of me. And then I'd look back down. Now, you're supposed to look out the plane and see if there's some other plane coming to hit you and that sort of stuff. But I didn't want to get lost. I didn't want to end up in the mountains again, so I kept my eyes on that highway. And it didn't take too long before the Rome airport showed up, about 30 minutes. And there it was. And I called somebody. I called on the Unicom and nobody answered, but I could see the windsock and I could see which runway they had to be using, so I got in the pattern. Remember, it's an uncontrolled airport, and landed. As I pulled off the runway and taxied toward the ramp in this little airport and where the FBO office was, I saw everybody running around like crazy, and they were tying down planes and they were storing stuff. And then this started happening, and I was going, what? And then I got out and looked out, and there was this huge thunderstorm just right there. If I'd have done what I was supposed to be doing and looking outside, this is what I would have seen as I was coming to Rome. Man, I'd have hurried up and gotten the ground. But if I hadn't been committed to getting my logbook signed in Rome and just decided I was going to follow Highway 27 all the way back to Noonan and still not look up, I'd have been in the middle of that thunderstorm, and I wouldn't have survived that, y'all. Now, I hadn't been flying long, and I'd only just begun studying the weather in terms of flying, but I grew up with an airline pilot daddy in the era before jets. And we used to sit out on our screened-in back porch, and he loved to do that during thunderstorms because he loved being there on the ground and not in the air during a thunderstorm. He used to say, flying's 99% boredom and 1% terror, and that terror part comes in thunderstorms. Like I said, he wasn't flying jets back then. He was flying Martin 404s and Convair 440s and DC-7s and all that, and they were flying through the weather. So I knew all about thunderstorms, and I know how close I had come to that being my last flight ever, or anything else. Ever. So after tying the plane down, I ran into the FBO office and I stood there at the window looking out at this huge thunderstorm going on, and I thought, I need to call Billy. We didn't have cell phones then, so I probably charged it to my home phone and called him because it would be long distance. And when he got on the phone, he said, "Where in the have you been?" And I told him, I said, "Well, I got lost, Billy." And I ended up in Chattanooga. Well, he said when the storm was over to fly back, and he would meet me at Carrollton. Carrollton was about halfway between Rome and Noonan. So I got my logbook signed. It's signed by Earl Palmar, as you can see here. I looked him up one time and found his obituary too. So I headed on down Highway 27, only this time I looked up every now and then to see if there was something I needed to be aware of. And when I got over Carrollton, there was Billy circling over Carrollton, and so I followed him back to Noonan. Now, I don't remember what he said once we got on the ground except for one thing. He asked me why I didn't get my logbook signed in Chattanooga too. Then I would have gotten credit for a longer cross-country trip. Like I said, Billy taught me how to fly. I learned things from Billy about flying that I want to learn from somebody else. But rules and regulations, they weren't really his top priorities, so he figured I should have taken advantage of my faux pas. But, I didn't. And that's my story about my first solo cross country. Now, I'm going to have another video before too long about the years that I spent being a line boy while I was a senior in high school and then first years in college at the Noonan Airport. And I tell you, when you got a bunch of 18 and 21-year-olds hanging around the airport and they're trying to figure out ways to pass the time, that you get some really good stories out of that. So y'all look for that. Even if you're not a pilot, I think it's stuff that you might enjoy. Meantime, in the words of the sadly late, great Dr. Miles Adams, it's always good to see you.